Welcome to an O'Connor Institute and Civics for Life conversation series discussion with Jeff Sikkenga. I'm Liam Julian with the O'Connor Institute. Jeff Sikkenga is Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center and Professor of Political Science at Ashland University. He has been a senior fellow in the program on constitutionalism and democracy at the University of Virginia, a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and the William E. Simon Distinguished Visiting Professor at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. He has published several books, including the one we'll be discussing today, co-authored with David Davenport, A Republic If We Can Teach It, Fixing America's Civic Education Crisis. Jeff, thanks a lot for joining us to talk about this book.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought we'd start. Maybe you could set the stage for everyone. Obviously in the subtitle of your book, you say civic education crisis in this country. Where are we today with civic education, and how did we get here?
Yeah, that the first part of the book actually talks about that. What is the crisis and what has caused it? I don't use the word crisis lightly. It's a very serious situation, and I think the problem is twofold. One is the incredible civic ignorance is what I would call it. The simple lack of knowledge of our history and principles by all classes of Americans, but in particular young people. And I think concomitant with that is the lack of attachment that many young people feel to the American story and to our founding principles and institutions. All the survey data shows, for example, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP test, which is given every 4 years, civics and history, U.S. civics and history, dismal scores. You can get on the test, you can get advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic. And unfortunately, only 22% in this last round of U.S. eighth graders scored proficient or better on U.S. civics, and only 14% on U.S. history. So more than 3/4 of young people are not proficient in their knowledge of American history and civics. And a poll in 2022 by Gallup showed that of all the classes, age groups of folks in America, when asked, are you extremely proud to be an American? Only 25% of young people 18 to 24 said yes. And that's the biggest gap ever between young people and old people, who at about 70%, 65 and above, said yes. There's never been a gap like that before. And I think those two facts are connected.
Yeah, and you do show in the book that that this is getting worse. That young people do know less than people who are older when it comes to civics. So, what's your sort of diagnosis here? What has happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. The cause, as David and I lay it out in the book, we really think it's twofold. We're doing less civics and history and worse civics and history. The less part is really astonishing when you look at the numbers. The federal government spends $54 per student in the United States on STEM education, and only a few pennies on civics and history education, just as one measure. But it's not just federal money, it's the amount of time that is devoted in a day in school to civics and history education. And it has gone down and down and down, really starting several decades ago, but accelerating with a focus on science. We call it the Sputnik moment, where American schools really reoriented themselves towards science and technology. But then No Child Left Behind and its focus on reading and math. And if you're tested on those things and federal money follows those things, that's what schools focus on. And there's only so much time and energy in a school day. So something had to give. And unfortunately, across the board, it's been history and civics. Time spent in instruction has gone down. And then I think the other part of it is, when we're doing civics and history, we're not doing it as well as we should be. Teachers haven't had the opportunity many times to become deep content experts in their area. And it's really hard to teach something in an engaging way if you haven't had the opportunity to learn it in a deep way. And the fact that we've moved away in many ways from primary documents, studying things like the text of the Constitution, toward textbooks, which are often boring or biased or sometimes both. And I would just challenge your listeners, if you know anybody, a young person in middle school or high school, ask them how their civics and history class is, and see if they don't say, yeah, it's actually pretty boring.
Yeah, right. And I want to get back to this about how we teach civics now, but just to sort of kind of finish sort of setting the stage, you do a great job, I think, in the book of showing that the lack of civics in schools now is a major departure. And in fact, civics education used to be at the core of American education. Maybe talk a little bit about the shift there, not just from a STEM or No Child Left Behind perspective, but also like a cultural perspective. You sort of note that it starts to become controversial civics, and that also sort of changed the way it was taught, how much it was taught.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't forget that public education started in the United States, particularly in the late 19th century and early 20th century, as a way to Americanize immigrants. And so public education was really a school for citizenship and cultivating the next generation of citizens. And then it started to add many things on top of that. So let's do numeracy, let's do literacy, let's do all of these things. But even then, in the early 20th and mid 20th century, it was for the sake of having informed citizens. So the citizenship component of American education was there from a very early time. And we have moved away from that understanding, that cultural understanding of, hey, when kids go to school, one of the primary reasons is we're raising the next generation of citizens, not just mathematicians, not just scientists, not just whatever it is, particular thing, but citizens for life. Culturally, we've moved away from that understanding of that purpose of our schools.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, Jeff. You talk about sort of having this Sputnik moment, where we decided we needed to sort of invest in math and science, um, and a lot of times these sort of educational shifts in direction are motivated by kind of national security concerns or economic concerns. Um, do you think we're at a place now with civics where some of those concerns are actually starting to bubble up to the extent that they are becoming as important as a Sputnik moment to combat the USSR, these sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're starting to see just in the last few years, 2, 3, 4 years, people realizing that civic education is essential for our national security in the sense of having a healthy, flourishing republic of self-governing citizens who are engaged in the public. We can't have a republic if we don't have citizens, and we
Yeah.
have to create citizens. They're not just born, they don't just inherit this knowledge of our history and principles that should be binding us together as an American people. They have to be learned. And I think people have begun to realize, okay, crisis is not an overblown word, and the effect of having citizens disengaged is calamitous for the republic.
Yeah.
Trust in institutions, in civil society and political society has plummeted. And when you have a lack of faith in institutions, lots of other things fill the void, which are not healthy, as we see in the culture around us, for citizenship.
Right. So let's talk a little bit then about we've established that we're not in a good place. Also established that we're teaching a lot less civics than we used to. What about the civics that's being taught today? You talk in the book about sort of this active civics. Is that what you call it? Sort of. What is this? Tell us about this.
Yeah, Action Civics is the
Action
title
civics.
it has sort of given itself. Um, uh, David and I have nothing against and are totally really in favor of citizens who are actively engaged in their local communities, in their state, and in their country. But the problem is that we've shifted in some ways in response to the idea, well, we're not doing as much civics, so we need to do it some, but we need to do some, and it's kind of boring, this textbook thing. So the response to that has been, well, let's go out and do stuff, and that's Action Civics. So do learn civics by engaging and doing civics. We argue that that kind of puts the cart before the horse, that if you want engaged citizens, they have to know what they're supposed to be engaged in and how they're supposed to do that. That means understanding the facts of American history. That means understanding how American institutions work, and most importantly, why those institutions and principles and structures have been set up. If you have that solid understanding, you should absolutely use that as a foundation for engagement. But unfortunately, it ends up being civic activity for the sake of activity often. And while it's almost might generate a little bit of a sugar high for some of the students who are involved, but it doesn't lay a foundation for long-term, lifelong productive citizenship.
Yeah. And you also point out that that sort of civics instruction, it lends itself in some cases to being politicized, which is sort of precisely what, well, I don't know if it's precisely what, but it is one of the reasons why civics is taught sort of hesitantly or less robustly, right? You guys talk in the book about teachers sort of being confused, what I can and cannot teach, how I should be teaching it. That's a big issue, right? If teachers don't understand what's expected of them.
Yeah, this is the terrible problem facing teachers, and the problem has gotten definitely worse over the last 5 to 10 years. Tackling civic issues that they just say, "This is politically controversial. I don't want anything to do with this." Things like elections and contested elections, for example. Yeah, we've found that that's true. Our own experience at the Ashbrook Center working with teachers is that they are nervous often to take those issues on, and partly because they themselves don't feel like they have mastery of the subject
Okay.
in such a way that they can speak authoritatively and say, okay, we had this very contested election in 2016 or 2020 presidential election. Have we had this in the past ever before? Oh, let's look at 1876, or let's look at 1860 or 1800, and to provide some deeper, fuller context for themselves and for their students to realize, okay, the republics had this before. How did we work through it last time? And I think that kind of that knowledge gives confidence to be able to take on those kind of difficult issues in a way that's nuanced and in a way that is honest and not politicized.
Yeah, that's right. So, are there places that you sort of are seeing that these challenges are being sort of met in a way that you think is a could give a way forward? I mean, do you see some glimmers of hope?
Yeah, I do. That's the
Okay.
second half of the book. Really, part one, as you know, is the crisis,
Yeah.
what it is, and how we got there. And part two is, okay, so what can we do about it?
Yeah.
And the good news is, there's a lot of good people out there doing good work in this area. What we need to do, as we say in the book, is all hands on deck. Everybody has to get involved and understand, okay, it's a crisis, but it's a solvable crisis if we get serious about it. So that means what we say is we need more history and civics education and better history and civics education.
And so, how does one? I mean, we're in a highly polarized environment, and not only is it sort of highly polarized, but the sort of it's polarized in a different sort of way. We've been seeing this rise in effective polarization, the idea that not only does this person disagree with me, but this person has bad motivations, this person is a bad person. um, in that type of environment, which I'm sure you historically know this has happened probably before, but in that type of environment, how is it that we come in a public school setting to agreements around how to teach civics, what should be taught, the way in which it should be taught? I mean, you write in the book about these school board meetings that have sort of devolved. They used to be just the most boring thing you could ever imagine, right? And now they're you bring your popcorn. So tell us, what's the way forward there in the environment that we find ourselves in today?
Yeah. For a boring school board meeting these
Right.
days. Yeah. We say in the book, well, first of all, let's take a step back.
Okay.
Civic education is, first of all, education. So let's understand a little bit about how we should be thinking about education and the principles of it that can inform a civic education classroom. And one thing we say is we really need to go back. We need to get rid of the notion, and this started, in the early, about 100 years ago or so, this notion of kind of industrial style education, where the bell rings, you move to the next class, the bell rings, you move to the next class, and you just ingest information, and then students just spit it out on a test, and then 2 weeks later they forgot what they just studied. I think you could ask any middle school, high school student, is that what your civics and history education is like? And most of them would say yes. So we say, look, that's not doing anybody any good, and it gets easily politicized. So what we can do is, what we say is, let's go back to this notion that education is fundamentally about cultivating informed patriots who can think for themselves about the important issues that the country faces. And how do you do that? We argue you need to root study, especially in middle and high school, in primary documents. And those documents of the past. So the role of government in the economy is a contentious issue that Americans have been disputing since the American founding. Well, if we want to have a conversation about that, let's go back to those moments, read those historic documents, both sides of the debate, and have a conversation about it. It's a lot more interesting. It's a lot more, brings history alive to the students, and it gets them in the habit of thinking and reflecting rather than just emoting, or rather than shutting down for fear of saying something that will offend someone. So we argue for classrooms as conversation centers, communities based on primary source documents. It takes the politics out of it. It takes the presentism, looking
Mhm.
at everything through the lens of the present, and
Mhm.
allows us to go back and realize, oh, again, the Republic has confronted these issues before. We've thought through these. Let's do that again. So we argue that if we get back to that understanding of education, and we have classrooms like that, and we give teachers the education in those primary documents, that you can have really lively, great conversations that are not boring at all, but are not also people shouting across the table at each other, across the classroom at each other, but having real, civil, serious, enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Jeb, because there's a political dimension obviously to this. There's also a pedagogical one, as you're pointing out, which is that instead of learning how to sort of read or identify a main idea by sort of reading this sort of textbook produced, stuff, why not read the actual source documents themselves? That would seem to be sort of beneficial in lots of ways, right? And so, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. I think anybody who's had a great teacher, and I
yeah,
just appeal to your listeners, own experiences. If you've had a great teacher, almost always it's someone who knew their subject very deeply,
hmm,
who loved their subject, and who just loved teaching students. And they had a kind of knowledge and enthusiasm that was just kind of infectious. If you ever had a great history, government, civics teacher, that's the kind of person they were. You get that by themselves studying the primary documents.
right. That's right. Um, so then, what sort of training should teachers be? I mean, how do we get teachers to the place where you're saying they feel much more conversant in these primary documents, where they feel as if they have that grounding, that historical knowledge that will allow them to facilitate these sorts of conversations with confidence? What needs to happen in the teacher training pipeline to get us there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's something that the good news is people are coming to see, especially people in the education field who have been through teacher training. My mom was a sixth grade social studies teacher for 42 years.
Yeah.
So we live this out in our family. What we need to do is we need to give teachers especially history and civics government teachers, we need to give them a content education as undergrads.
Okay.
It's really amazing how much time is spent in teacher preparation on pedagogy
Yeah, sure.
and not on the content of the thing they're going to teach. Some pedagogical knowledge and certainly experience is necessary,
Yeah.
but we argue in the book a lot less than is being done now, and a lot more content knowledge is actually needed. The stories of young teachers who are just one chapter ahead of their students in the textbook
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
trying to teach, that's hard. We're putting teachers at a great disadvantage and their students at a great disadvantage if we're throwing teachers like that into the classroom without that kind of knowledge. And once you're in the classroom, if you don't go back and get great professional development in the content,
Yep.
You continue to be like that. And
Yep.
and that's not the kind of classroom that a lot of teachers want to lead, but it's the classroom that they're trapped into having because their education didn't focus on content. So we argue, first and foremost, teacher education should be based in content. And secondly, we need to really think about certification of teachers in a different way that
Okay.
allows for people who have that kind of content knowledge and are
I see.
just good at teaching to be able to teach.
I see. So essentially, sort of maybe making some of the requirements a little bit more flexible to allow people into the classroom, essentially, is what you're saying?
Yeah, and as long as they have a demonstrated knowledge of the subject,
Yep.
and they're good teachers. So we argue, for example, apprenticeship. We should bring
Oh.
back the idea of apprenticing young
Hmm.
people to teachers, to master teachers who can really show them. So much of teaching, as any teacher out there knows, is you just kind of learn it by doing it very often. You have to be in your own classroom, running it, and having teaching students before you really realize, oh, this is how I should be doing this.
Yeah.
We want teachers to have that kind of apprenticeship experience. If I think if you combine that with a deep content knowledge, you're going to have a significantly more prepared teachers for history and civics.
Yeah, it's so interesting how this problem really stretches pretty far and wide in the sense that what you're talking about, right, is a sort of a change even to undergraduate curricula and ed schools, the way they do business. So there are solutions as you point out, but probably difficult and need a lot of buy-in. Are there any ed schools, any places that you feel have sort of really taken this on and sort of are moving in the direction you'd like to see?
Well, I'll just give you one example here in my home state of Ohio. Ohio State University is now directing people who want to teach toward undergraduate degrees in a content area, and then saying if you for pedagogy come back or stay a year. Sometimes it's called at some places called bachelor's plus. Stay a year and do some pedagogy and do some apprenticeship after you have the content knowledge. So there are some schools who are thinking about that. Here at Ashland University and the Ashbrook Center, we're starting a program for that kind of content and apprenticeship-based teaching. And we're seeing in places like Arizona and Texas, where they're relaxing some certification requirements to allow good people to be able to teach. So it's starting, but I think you're right, Liam. It's going to take, it's a big revolution that has to happen, a big change, and it has to be proven. We've had this model of teacher education and certification for at least 50 years now, and it is entrenched like all systems. And it's going to take some experimentation to prove that it can work in another way to be able to really get some traction. But I think it's starting to happen.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And surely I mean, you've paid attention to what seems to be this kind of these green shoots of civics kind of growing up in these universities all around the country, oftentimes at places where perhaps they would be unexpected. Stanford University being one that has a very robust sort of civics program that's grown up there at the moment. So it does seem that there's an openness to this at this moment that is a bit different than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. People realize the situation is serious. They realize we need to be educating the next generation of citizens, and that we can't just take that for granted, that we have to be very intentional about doing more and better for students and educating teachers. So yeah, we're seeing places like Stanford. We've seen civics institutes pop up at various states, including in Arizona.
Mhm.
So people are seeing the crisis. What we want to make sure is that it's not simply a negative reaction to the situation, but embracing positive ideas for improvement and reform.
Yeah, that's so important. I really like Jeff in the book how you quote Reagan and sort of this notion of an informed patriotism, and I just thought rhetorically that was so powerful. This idea of patriotism growing out of in educating oneself, and being prepared and able to make one's own to come to one's own conclusions in this area. It's not about indoctrination. It's not about teaching kids to believe a certain way, but rather giving them all of the facts and then the tools to interpret those facts.
Yeah, absolutely right. What we say in the book is we want students to love America, but because they understand why it's lovable.
Yeah,
So it's
sure.
not indoctrination
Yeah,
on either way. And if students don't come to that conclusion, that's fine. As long as they've had an honest encounter with the primary documents of our history and with the American story in all of its richness and complexity. And it means, look, it means, of course, it means teaching students, exposing them and having them discover the good, the bad, and the ugly of American history. Does not mean whitewashing history, does not mean indoctrinating in a certain view. It just means let's be honest and have an open, interesting, primary source rooted conversation about these things. And then you decide for yourselves. We think, David and I, if you do that, in the end, you do come to a position and a place of informed patriotism. But
yeah.
that's not where you start, that's where you end.
Right, right. Very important. Yeah. Well, to wrap up, Jeff, I get the sense that you're, can I dare I say, optimistic here? That, or maybe hopeful is a better. Tell us, where do
Yeah,
you see
that's
us
a
in
great
five,
question. I have
10,
on my
20 years?
desk well, appropriate for the O'Connor Institute. I have on my desk a saying from Ronald Reagan. It says, "It can be done."
Okay. Yeah.
At Reagan appointing Justice O'Connor, of course.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm hopeful because the crisis is serious, but people are beginning to recognize the crisis and they're beginning to say, what can we do to solve this crisis? This is an issue that cuts across political parties, across political philosophies. It's an issue that Americans of all backgrounds can embrace, public officials of all backgrounds can embrace. It really is something when you start talking to people about this, they say, shouldn't students and their teachers sit down in a classroom and read the Constitution together? Who says no to that? The problem is it's just not happening because people aren't prepared to be able to do that. So that's just one example of, yeah, this is an issue. That's why I'm hopeful. And I'm hopeful because in our experience at the Ashbrook Center, when we do that with students and with teachers, their response is overwhelmingly, I love this. We need to keep doing this. Let's do more of this.
Hmm.
So our own experience, and I think the data show that if you do more and you do it better, it does have an effect on the crisis.
Yeah. A nice note to end on. Jeff Sikkenga, thank you so much. The book is A Republic If We Can Teach It. Thanks so much for doing the work. I know at the O'Connor Institute, we're also invested in this and trying to do what we can to improve the situation. Books like yours are just so important right now to sort of not only identify the problems, which it seems every day we read in the news about the problems, but the focus on solutions that you have is so helpful. So thanks for doing the work. And thanks for talking to us about it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for having me, and thanks for the great work of the O'Connor Institute. It's great to be working with partners like you all out there. As we say in the book, it's all hands on deck. Everybody has a role in this.